think particularly with all the furore that has happened over the last, a couple of months ago with the football Super League and the sort of fan protest that took place against that, I think is a bit reminiscent of the background to the announcement of the Super League in Rugby League and what took place then. And really, this year is the 25 years since the inaugural season of Super League, which I think was, possibly the biggest shift in Rugby League since its foundation as a Northern Union in the George Hotel in Huddersfield in 1895. And I'm just going to go into a little bit of background just for any comrades that aren't that familiar with that, because that break in 1895 was a result of a crusade by certain sections of the middle class leadership of the Rugby Football Union, which was mostly based in the south, but also had people of that view in Yorkshire as well. There was a public school master in Huddersfield called Frank Marshall that was particularly zealot of enforcing this sort of idea of strict amateurism, where those sort of middle class ex-public school people who kind of led the game of rugby union at that time were worried that the growth of kind of working class players playing the sport would squeeze them out, as had started to take place in association football as well. And working class players from the north of England, especially from Yorkshire and Lancashire, had begun to dominate rugby. The county championship was won by Yorkshire 6 out of 7 years between 1889 and 1895, and the only year they didn't win it was won by Lancashire. And the England captain in 1894 was Dickie Lockwood, who was an unskilled manual labourer from Criggleston near Wakefield, and that was the first time it hadn't been, again, an ex-public schoolboy doing that. Yet these players, by playing rugby, were putting themselves in a financially vulnerable position that their middle-class peers weren't. That would, in terms of if they were injured or lost time off work, that hit them financially in the pocket much harder than their middle-class peers who maybe lawyers or doctors who, being injured won't necessarily stop them from working or wouldn't have as big a detrimental impact in their income. And that's why the demand for broken time payments, for payment for time off work to play and train, as well as support for lost earnings whilst injured, and the costs of being injured, was taken up by many of the northern rugby clubs. This was rejected out of hand by the RFU, and a few years down the line, as the kind of breaches of amateur rules were prosecuted, and not just kind of obvious breaches, but almost like persecution of some clubs and some players. Then you had the Northern Union established as a breakaway by 22 clubs in 1895, and at first the game wasn't that different from the rules rugby union was played under. But over the course of the next decade, then various changes were made to make the game more open and entertaining, including reducing the number of players to 13, abolishing the line out, and introducing the play of the ball. Obviously there's been more changes since then as well. But in that period of sort of a decade or so after that took place, and the RFU's ongoing crusade against veiled professionalism, as they call it, meant that anybody who played rugby league, even as an amateur, would be banned for life. And that, I think, only was rescinded, just prior to the Super League coming about. I think in the maybe a year or so beforehand. But in areas such as Wales or Australia, where the sport was primarily based in working class sport of rugby was primarily based in working class areas, and the same problems as in the north cropped up and were resolved by things such as boot money. I.e. players were paid, but no one talked about it. And if you didn't talk about it, then it was all right. When you talked about it, as I think one player in Australia in the run up to the rugby league being formed there did, then they were sort of heavily punished for doing so. Not so much for the breach, but for speaking openly about it. And it was a product of this hypocrisy and the very partial way such rules were implemented, which played a key role in rugby league spreading to Australia, where it became the dominant sport, and New Zealand in both in 1908 and France in the 1930s. And the weakening as well from the establishment of the Northern Union, where the England Rugby Union team had lost its best players to the Northern Union, had an effect of strengthening union in the other home nations who could now regularly defeat them. For example, Wales, the Welsh Rugby Union never lost a game to England between 1899 and 1909. And that, combined with Wales Rugby Union players being signed up to Northern League clubs, if they wanted to change code, was the main reason why league struggled to get a foothold in Wales. And there's obviously lots of other developments you could talk about in terms of history of rugby league, and that over the over a period of 90 years or so since then. But I think for time's sake, I have to come forward to the 90s, and the period of the formation of the Super League, because the game then was still most prolifically played in Australia and England, with the former Australia more predominant. In England, Wigan won the Challenge Cup 8 times in a row between 1987 and 1995, and won the league 7 times in that period as well. And with the rise of satellite broadcasting, then series money from television rights, which had come into the sport, a couple of decades previously, that was coming into the game, was like much bigger sums of money with satellite competition. And bidding wars started to take place over rights. So you had, for example, the formation of the Premier League in 1992 under the auspices of the kind of then ITV boss, and that. But actually, Sky won the bidding wars for the rights for that. And in particular, key to the formation of Super League in England was the war over TV rights for Australian Rugby League between Murdoch and another media mogul, Kerry Packer, which developed over 1994 to 95, resulting in Murdoch running a rival, what was called Super League competition, to the official league in 1997. And ultimately, that led in Australia to Murdoch's News Corporation getting joint control as part of a peace deal for the next 15 years in the newly formed National Rugby League there. But that struggle had a number of side effects. In Australia, the increased competition for rugby players because of the two leagues, and needed to have more players to fill the teams and so on as professionals, led to pressing for rugby union to become openly professional, as it did in autumn 1995, to try and compete for those Australian players. But also to shore up his own position in the rights battle in Australia, then Murdoch signed up the UK Rugby Football League clubs to what was dubbed at the time a European Super League. Within days of initial meeting, then, in my opinion, greedy club executives jumped at a £77 million deal, which has seen many historic clubs forced into mergers with local rivals, 2 new clubs joined the league from France, and no relegation or promotion for at least 2 years. And obviously those proposals saw a massive backlash. Amongst some of what took place, and I've got vague memories of this, but other comrades in the meeting will know more. 1,000 fans stormed the pitch ahead of a game at Halifax against being merged with Bradford, which was initially mooted and but not actually in the concrete proposals going forward. Whilst there was protests at by Cass and Featherstone fans jointly at their derby game. There was a meeting in Sheffield on the proposed merger with Sheffield Eagles that took place that found 16 voting for a merger out of 400 attendees. And a poll in the Wakefield Express about the merger of Trinity, Feather Rovers and Cass found 90% opposition. There was a joint meeting of supporters of those 3 clubs, which we reported in the paper. Comrades in this meeting took part in as well, in opposition to the proposals. And within 3 weeks, the mergers were off, and an increased offer of £87 million was accepted. And I think we have to say that the sort of top-down way and rushed expansion that was proposed was a failure, as it has been on a number of other occasions since. After 2 years, the Paris club, which was only one of the French clubs that actually materialised, collapsed following a number of financial and contractual scandals. A round of mergers in 1999 ended up with 2 mergers which effectively swallowed up clubs in expansion areas. Sheffield, which had existed for 15 years, it's been reborn since, but that was merged with Huddersfield. And Gateshead, who'd only played a single season, was merged with Hull. In reality, the only successful expansion of the league has taken place on the basis of establishing professional clubs in areas where the game is already being played, such as the southwest of France with Super League club Catalan Dragons and Toulouse Olympique, who are playing in the Championship as well as a club there. The change to a summer season, which comrades may have differing views over. In my opinion, as somebody who was starting playing around the time of this, I definitely preferred it to winter. Other comrades might differ on that. I think it's led to the game being faster paced. I think more exciting, and I have to say I much preferred when I started watching games, watching them in the summer rather than the winter. It did lead to an increase in attendances compared to the all winter season. There was an average peak of attendances in 2008 of 10,338 across the league, although that went into decline afterwards, which I think is down to a few factors. I think particularly the kind of economic crisis, the impact of that, the austerity and the squeezing of working class people's incomes, is a key factor. But also, I think the sort of 6-year trial of franchising we went through, which removed promotion and relegation, I think, I think took away from the game, in my opinion. But whilst the sport isn't just dominated by Wigan in quite the same way as they had done at the time of the formation of the Super League, they are just one of 4 teams that have won the Super League grand final since its inception. Those 4 teams, Wigan, Leeds, St Helens and Bradford. Another 3 teams have won the League Leaders' Shield, and the Challenge Cup's been won by another 4 teams on top of those 4. And actually, the Challenge Cup's probably been the thing that's been the most varied. There's only one of those big 4 teams that have won it in the last 5 years. The salary cap, which was brought in by Super League, was meant to increase the numbers of teams that were competitive. It's more competitive than just Wigan. But actually, if you go back further, there was a much more varied number of teams that were competitive and so on. In that period before Wigan's dominance, it was also supposed to stave off the possibilities of clubs becoming insolvent, but that didn't stop that happening to what they call now Bradford Bulls, but what was Bradford Northern in 2012. And whilst the salary cap set at 2.1 million in Super League for this season, there's loads and loads of loopholes when you look at it. The top 2 players don't count. There's exemptions for this, that, and the other. But even that figure is less than half the level of the Rugby Union Premiership and the Australian NRL. There's a whole question, I think, about the finances of the game that I do want to point to some stuff around, because obviously the shutdown around COVID hit the game hard, with the 2020 season being suspended and the 2021 season that we're just in the middle of now, starting behind closed doors, with fans only returning really in the last few weeks. That's led to Rugby League getting 2 bailouts over the last year from the government, one of 16 million and the second one of 12 million. But also, what's worrying for the financial situation of the game is the new broadcast deal that's been negotiated, which as things stand is for the next 2 years, but it comes in at least 10 million, if not 15 million pounds lower than the current deal, which is for 40 million. And includes broadcasting less games, which, if there was potential for, another deal on terrestrial TV to broadcast some Super League games there, I think that would be a positive from my point of view, especially somebody who doesn't have Sky. But that's, it's 14 games less than currently scheduled to be broadcast. And the 2 leagues below Super League, whose broadcast rights had been covered in that previous deal, but rarely had any coverage, are likely to be the biggest losers, because a lot of the money that's been cut would have been money that would have been going to them. In comparison, the NRL in Australia recently signed a new 5-year deal, which is worth £1 billion. I think it's something like 1.8 or 1.7 Australian dollars, as well. But I would say the biggest casualty of the kind of COVID has been the recent Canadian expansion team, Toronto Wolfpack, who, because of how there were the terms for entering League One back in 2017, were ineligible for any support from the RFL and were unable to access furlough like UK-based teams. Before the team folded, there was reports of players failed to pay wages owed and so on as well. Now, while Super League don't have any owners drawn from the Gulf states, the former USSR or US investors like in football, then I do think we still have some of the same problems, maybe not on the same scale, in terms of how profit-driven the big clubs and the leadership of the game remain. When deciding not to admit Toronto under potential new owners into into this year's Super League, the independent review of the club that was commissioned and of other possible future expansion teams in North America concluded that, and I quote, it added no material incremental revenue to Super League in the short or medium term, as the main criteria. And likewise, when Lee were admitted in their stead for this season, then the first 2 criteria out of 5 against which they were judged were: 1, to enhance the commercial value of Super League to broadcast and sponsorship partners of Super League Europe, and 2, to deliver value to other members of Super League. And this, in my opinion, short-sighted viewpoint of the business interests who dominate the game came through again with the decision, which has been reversed or partially reversed since, to strip elite academy status from a number of teams' youth academies, which, following outrage from players and parents, has since partially been, partially been reversed. But I think it's particularly outrageous given that England, if all things going well with COVID and that, is due to host the Rugby League World Cup later this year, which you'd hope would encourage more young people to play the game. Now, Rugby League, I think, has an important history of being born out of attempts to exclude working class sports people from the highest levels of rugby. But in my opinion, when we're sort of discussing Rugby League, it'd be a mistake to describe it or also, association football as an out-and-out working class sport. Because I think whilst the players and fans are overwhelmingly from this background, and that has a definite impact on the culture of the game, in a few ways. I mentioned Dickie Lockwood earlier, but he, after the formation of Rugby League, organised benefit matches to support the strike funds during the 1897 and 98 engineers lockout. And more recently, you had when the bin workers were on strike in Leeds, you had the Leeds captain and England captain Kevin Sinfield joining the strikers, which I'm not sure you'd have from the captain of the England soccer team and that. But like all sports under capitalism, Rugby League remains dominated by the club owners who, in 1895 decided their commercial interests were best served by breaking from the rugby union hierarchy, and have been influenced by their same interests since, including the decision to form Super League in 1995. Like in wider society, the interests of predominantly working class fans and players can only be served by them being able to take democratic control over the game. And so I think as socialists, we need to put forward a programme and a strategy as to how this could be done. And I do think it's worth, comrades, looking at the Reclaim the Game pamphlet that John Reid has written, about soccer and that in various editions. But in the pamphlet, then he and other comrades have developed a programme of the way forward for that sport. And based on that, I think there are some stuff we could put forward and maybe comrades would want to discuss around, expand on, develop other points. But I think, in relation to the domination of the game by the interests, particularly the biggest clubs, then, I think we have to raise, the idea of democratic control of the clubs and of the game as a whole by elected representatives of fans through supporters, trust supporters clubs, and elected representatives of players and staff. On the question of financing the game, I think clearly, given the dominance, like in football, of TV money, then I think we ought to be raising the question of the nationalisation of the big media companies. Also, the question of sharing out the TV money more evenly throughout all levels of the game, not just concentrating it at the top. And by that, I don't even mean just the professional, semi-professional clubs, but I mean into the grassroots as well. There's also the question that is raised in relation to soccer of local authority ownership of grounds, which exists for some clubs in Super League even, but not others. But I think one of the things that could be raised as well is a return to the system of pooling of a proportion of gate receipts to be shared throughout the league. As did exist, I think, until the 80s or so. And then also this question of expansion, and how do you expand the game? How do you develop the game? I think we would have to put emphasis on cultivating the grassroots game, and not just abandoning the heartlands and thinking that would, areas where rugby league's been played and watched for a long period of time, are just able to just get on while money's poured into clubs all over, in other parts of the world on a speculative basis. I think it's good for the game to have rugby league played in other parts of the world, but I think that's got to be based on a real, genuine grassroots support and sustainability, and not on trying to set a marquee down in a big city somewhere just to kind of for the sort of spectacle, or because the TV bosses are calling for it. It's got to be based on really developing the grassroots and being able to expand and enrich the game at all levels, including internationally as well. So I hope those are a few points that hopefully comrades might want to discuss. I'm sure comrades have got other thoughts that they want to raise, but hopefully that will give us a bit of an introduction to a discussion.